Hi everyone, welcome to this third video lecture for Digital Hermeneutics. Today we're going to have a look at two things, Russian formalism and structuralism. And these are two movements that in their own way try to formulate a science of literary interpretation. We start with Russian formalism, and you can think of it as the Russian variety of new criticism. Like the new critics, Russian formalists were concerned with the formal aspects of language, and they're interested in making the study of literature more scientifically robust. It's also a movement that predates the new critics by a good few decades, so in a way it was very much ahead of its time. Second is structuralism. And so far, we've been talking about movements that insist on paying careful attention to the text, and the text only. Structuralism is a branch of literary theory that occurred after the New Critics, mainly in the 1960s, and that constitutes an entirely different way of scientifically reading texts, an entirely different way of revealing what literature can mean. Structuralism is almost the opposite of new criticism in that it seeks to examine not just the structure within a work, but also the structure between works. It seeks to go beyond the abstract ideas or element in a text, like irony, tension, ambiguity, and so on, in order to examine what is underneath it. So we'll discuss one of the founding fathers of structuralism, Ferdinand de Saussure, to see where the structuralists get their ideas from. Russian formalism was a school of literary criticism in Russia from the 1910s to the 1930s. It included Russian and Soviet scholars such as Viktor Shklovsky, Vladimir Prop, Boris Eichenbaum, and Roman Jakobson. Like the new critics, Russian formalists advocated a scientific method for studying poetic language, to the exclusion of traditional psychological and cultural historical approaches. Now, this takes place in the context of Russian literary criticism. Like the new critics, the formalists were responding to their academic predecessors. In this case, it was Russian symbolism, a 19th century romantic approach that was dominant in academia at the time. It was all about the unconscious and irrationalism and mysticism. It was influenced by the likes of Dostoevsky and Baudelaire, Wagner and Nietzsche. Much like the new critics, the Russian formalists wanted to make the methods of literary criticism a little bit more robust, more systematic and replicable. The Russian formalists are interested in poetry and in poetic language, as they call it. They see this kind of language as something that slows us down, that makes us pause, that gets in the way of arriving at meaning. Think back on that poem we read last week, right? It doesn't immediately make sense. It resists, it fights back, so to say. Now, the scientific method that the Russian formalists developed has everything to do with creating a taxonomy, a systematic classification. Well, in order to do that, you first need to define some first principles. To the Russian formalists, it wasn't about literature. I mean, what is literature anyway? No, it was about literariness as a scientific principle from which the rest of their taxonomy sort of follows. Note at this point the word formalism. To the Russian formalists, everything was about formal aspects of literature, much like with the new critics. It's never about content, in the sense that even a text's content, so its referentiality to the world, for instance, would be considered a formal device. Jakobson would call it a society function. In other words, even what we might think of as the contents of a story are, to the Russian formalists, an aspect of how the story is told, how it works. I think you can relate this pretty easily to the heresy of paraphrase of the new critics. Paraphrasing would assume that there is such a thing as contents, which are sort of extra textual, but in talking about literature or about art in general, that's precisely what we shouldn't do if we want to understand it. We have to look at the text itself and how it makes its point, not just what that point is. A big difference with the new critics has to do with what the Russian formalists call defamiliarization and the inherent innovation that literature engages in. Shklovsky called this the roughening of the surface. Again, this was a response against the symbolists who came before. These people were all about thinking in images, about sort of an immediate, intuitive understanding of art. In other words, they were about presenting the unknown in terms of the known. And Shklovsky and the Russian formalists wanted to turn this around. They said, no, we have to make the familiar strange. This is very important to the Russian formalists. And as we'll keep seeing, the reason why these schools of criticism take interest in certain aspects of literature is almost always because of the political reality that they find themselves in. In this case, the Russian formalists are also responding to a sense of bureaucratization that they see around them in early 20th century Russia. A lot of what you read in the Russian literature of that time, in Dostoevsky or Gogol or Goncharov, it's all about this grayness, this ordinariness, this dullness of life. Wallace Stevens, one of the great American poets, later summarized this point by saying, poetry should make the visible a little hard to see. So make us see the world itself anew, tearing the film from our eyes. In other words, the Russian formalists are interested in the form of literature instead of the content because of the capacity of form to defamiliarize. And this is why they're interested in innovation. They argue that new forms are necessary because old forms cannot defamiliarize anymore. They've become cliché. So you can see there are clearly some similarities to what we've discussed last week, but we shouldn't take those similarities too far. Russian formalism is also very importantly opposed to both the tradition of hermeneutics and to the ideas that the new critics pick up on. The formalists are much more anti-establishment. These other approaches were not just interested in innovation, but also, as we heard Matthew Arnold say, the best that had been thought and said. They come from a more conservative background. And this anti-establishment thing that the Russian formalists have going on is very evident in the fascination they have with the idea of struggle. Eichenbaum, one of the main representatives of the Russian formalists, talks about a struggle for science that defines Russian formalism. You hear the influence here of two of his contemporaries, Marx and Darwin, both of whom are obsessed with this struggle for dominance. The Russian formalists sort of exported these concerns to the realm of literature. They saw literary evolution as a struggle for dominance, but one of devices and techniques. So to them, it's always about tracing this dominant function, there the word is again, of the text. Russian formalism didn't live a particularly long life, unfortunately. Its focus on complicated literature was, as you might imagine, not a very good fit for the proletariat revolution. And under Stalin, Russian formalism became a very pejorative, negative term for elitist art. So basically the opposite of what they were trying to achieve. So we've been talking about functions, and now it's time to look at those a bit more closely. Jakobson's model of the functions of language distinguishes 6 elements, or factors of communication. And he says these are necessary for communication to occur. So let's have a look at them. The first function is referential. It's about describing a situation, or an object, or a mental state. If I say the ball fell on the floor, then that's a referential function. because I'm just referring to a ball that somewhere falls on the floor. The second function is the poetic function. And this one focuses on the message for its own sake, the code itself and how it's used. It's language that gets in the way. An example is a poetic line such as, "Never until the mankind making, bird, beast, and flower." That is not a sentence that immediately makes sense to you. You have to dig a little bit in order to see what's going on there. The third function is emotive, and it relates back to the sender. It has to do with interjections and other sound changes that do not necessarily alter the denotative meaning of an utterance, but they do add information about the sender's internal state. Things like, "Wow, that's great that you just said that." Fourth, the conative function. This one engages the receiver directly, and it's best illustrated by imperatives. When my mom used to call me when I was playing in the garden, and she'd say, "Tom, come inside and eat," this is a conative function. It's intended for me to respond to it and to do something with it. Fifth, there is the phatic function. And this is language for the sake of interaction itself. Things like greetings and casual discussions of the weather. It has everything to do with the communication channel, opening it, maintaining it, verifying it, closing it, and so on. So when I'm on the phone with someone, I might open with "hello," and during the conversation, I might say things like, "Okay, yeah." And these are all just to indicate that I'm still listening and to make sure that the other party knows that the communicative channel is still open. Finally, there's the metalingual function, and that's the use of language to describe itself. If somebody asks you, "Why don't you know what this particular word means?" then that's a metalingual function. It's language about language. There are several ways in which you can represent these functions. This is one of them. To the left, you see the sender or the addressor, and they have the emotive function. There is the context of a message, which is to do with referential functions. There's the message, which might carry a poetic function. There's the receiver or the addressee, who belongs to the conative function. There is the channel or the contact through which these two people are communicating. That has everything to do with the phatic function. And then finally, there's the code of language, which is metalingual. Notice that in the center of this is the message, and the message is related to the poetic function. This is why the formalists are especially interested in that poetic function. This week in our discussions section, you'll be able to do a little exercise with Jakobson's functions. You'll be asked to go to the subreddit that you're analyzing and have a look at which of the functions that Jakobson identifies are most dominant in your subreddit. So are they mostly referential? Are they mostly conative? Are they metalingual? What kind of language do people on your subreddit mostly engage in? Before we go on, we need to talk a little bit about the context of philosophy in the 20th century. Structuralism only became dominant in literary theory in the 1960s, but it was developed much earlier in the 19th century. And it sort of coincides with another movement in philosophy that's called the linguistic turn. Now, during that time, there was a dominant way of thinking about language, which had been the dominant way for roughly 2 millennia. It basically considered words as labels which were attached to concepts. So according to that view, there is something like the real chair, which exists in some external, unknowable reality, but that corresponds roughly with a concept in human thought, a chair, to which then the linguistic term chair refers. So there is a reality, and our words simply express that reality. Now, this is what's called the linguistic turn. And some say that this linguistic turn is responsible for a schism in philosophy itself. And that's the schism between continental and analytic philosophy. The diverging of these types of philosophy has everything to do with how different philosophers respond to ideas about language that were important at the time. Specifically, it has to do with how philosophers deal with the metaphysics of two very important philosophers, Immanuel Kant, who we shortly spoke about last week, and George Hegel. This whole thing has to do with Hegel's rejection of Kant's separation of things we can know, things we have language for, and things that actually exist. Kant calls this the difference between the phenomenal and the noumenal. And the noumenal is reality, the world as it is in itself, independently of our mental activities. Think back of the objectivist framework we discussed in week 1. One of Kant's main ideas is that as humans, we parse the world in certain ways. Our mind works in certain ways. And we create certain categories in which we understand reality. Things like cause and effect, or quantity. But to Kant, that meant that we can only understand things in terms of these categories. The noumenal, the thing in itself, as he called it, was impossible to know. By the way, note that Kant here is sort of predicting constructionism as well, which we talked about in week 1 as well, right? Whatever we call reality is something that we, as humans, create. We can't really know the objective facts. Now, this is where Hegel comes in. He does not agree with Kant. Hegel was an idealist in philosophical terms. That is, he said, well, isn't it strange to assume a division between appearance and this noumenal reality? How can you think about something you cannot know? He asked. Because what you're doing in that act is precisely thinking about this noumenal reality, right? I mean, I just spoke of it. I have it in mind. So there has to be some sort of connection that we have to the world. Even the unthinkable is, in essence, thinkable. Now, the next point Hegel makes is that this understanding of reality itself is not static, as it is with Kant. It's in movement. It changes throughout history. And to Hegel, as an idealist, that means there is a possibility of improved accuracy of these thoughts. So Hegel believes in a development from less sophisticated definitions or views or ideas to more sophisticated ones later in time. So you have this increasing comprehensiveness and universality in the concepts that you can develop as a philosopher, which ultimately, in Hegel's words, drives it to completion. Right? Theory would reach what Hegel calls the absolute, with a capital A, which is sort of the last final concept or form in the whatever subject matter we're talking about. Something that contains all the other concepts or forms that were developed earlier in this process of history. In fact, this is what he thought of science. He called this the soul of scientific progression. Now, these metaphysics of Hegel, this preoccupation with abstract concepts such as being, knowing, time, and so on, that's the precursor for what we now call continental philosophy. This is philosophy that emphasizes these grand, overarching narratives and the inclusion of everything, including literature and history and art and so on, into the quest of philosophy. So philosophy as a totalizing enterprise. It's Hegel's concern with metaphysics, the fundamental nature of reality, which ultimately led to the split between continental and analytic philosophy. Analytic philosophy started with some philosophers in Cambridge and Vienna in the 19th and 20th century who saw these theories of Hegel as being very dangerous. Right? Think about it. This idea of the absolute, which basically means God. I mean, Hegel was a very religious man. This is a story about some linear human progress on the basis of which you could start comparing, say, the progress of cultures. Culture A is this far towards the absolute, culture B is only this far. This is why someone like Karl Popper, he's the man behind the positivist doctrine we discussed in week 1, he blames Hegel for spewing the kind of talk that would lead to ethno-nationalism in the 20th century. And this is why, really, the heart of the opposition between analytic and continental philosophers is most evident in methodology. That is, in a focus on either analysis or synthesis. Continental philosophers typically address these large questions in a synthetic way. They take all of it into the fold. Analytic philosophers, they try to solve these fairly delineated philosophical problems by reducing them to their parts and to the relations in which these parts stand. Some folks that led the analytic tradition are Bertrand Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein. And as you can probably surmise at this point, they were quite interested in the idea of language, the logic of language, specifically propositions, truth claims, and so on, and their relation to facts. They're about as far from Hegel as you can get. They don't think at all that language is something that directly tracks reality. Wittgenstein writes at the end of his much too short life that conceptual confusions surrounding language use are at the root of most philosophical problems. So he wants to understand language itself better instead of seeing it as some transparent mode of communication. He notes that it's not simply the case that individual words in language name objects and that sentences are just combinations of such names. He argues that language is a good deal more complex than that. Anyway, when you know this, you'll understand that structuralism, as it's taken up years later in the continental tradition, for instance with Roland Barthes, whom we'll discuss in a minute, comes from an analytic concern with scientific understanding of poetic language. These are some memes that illustrate the differences of how continental philosophers view analytic philosophers and vice versa. You see the analytic philosopher who is apparently in a relationship and who cannot really have any discussion with his partner because she needs to define love and prove that it exists, which leads him to be very lonely. Whereas on the other side, continental philosophy is depicted as a very emotional professor saying, "This hurts my feelings. I am the warrior of my daydreams." Whereas the analytic philosopher is a rational and logical figure who asks for proper facts and evidence, very much embedded in the objectivistic tradition that we saw in week 1. Now, it's the same concern with what language does that also at the end of the 19th century starts concerning the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure. And he's interested in it from the perspective of what he calls semiology, basically language as a system of signs. Note the difference with semiotics, which comes from someone else, the American pragmatic philosopher Peirce, and his project is a lot like de Saussure's in one way, but he doesn't concern himself with language as much as de Saussure does. One of de Saussure's innovations is how he distinguishes between the system of language versus all the utterances of language in speech and writing. Saussure's main point, and this is why it's called structuralism, was that language as a whole is a complex system of signs that expresses ideas with rules that govern its usage. So a complex system with rules. He writes, human language is not a function of the speaker. It is a product that is passively assimilated by the individual. What he means by that is that language is not my language. It doesn't originate in me. It's a convention, something that belongs to the public sphere. Saussure says, language speaks us. It's not the other way around. We cannot escape language. We can only express language in language. So this whole idea of the noumenon, the thing outside language as it really is, that's unknowable here. So to the Saussure, language isn't something I speak. It's something virtual. It's an aggregate. It's a totality of grammar, syntax, and the lexicon, the vocabulary. And this totality, this structure, is what he calls langue. Note again the postulation of an overarching explanatory system. This is why de Saussure belongs to the continental tradition. Right, so there is this system. But at the same time, we do use language. We apply it. We speak. We can only really infer the structure of language from these actual words that we use. This is comparable to Freudian analytics, another structuralist theory, where the psychologist can only infer the unconscious mind of their client through the conscious signs that they are giving off. These individuated human acts of using language is what de Saussure calls parole. It's this unfolding of language in time, as we speak. To de Saussure and all of structuralism, really, all linguistic signs can be ordered into two components, the signifier and the signified. The signifier is the word we utter, the sound image, as de Saussure calls it. And the signified is the concept in our mind that the world, and the signifier is the concept in our mind that the word refers to. Now, Saussure's great innovation is that he says two things about how signs come to be. The first one is that the linguistic sign is arbitrary. It's a combination of form and meaning that is based on convention instead of natural resemblance. We call this thing I sit on a chair, but we might as well have called it a schnufti. So language doesn't refer to categories that exist outside of language. Saussure says if words stood for pre-existing concepts, they would have exact equivalence in meaning from one language to the next, which is obviously not the case. Each language has its own system of conventional signs that organizes the world. Each language is a theory of the world, if you will. Think back on the discussion we had on linguistic relativity last week. Different languages divide up the world differently, in other words. In other words, different languages divide up the world. In other words, different languages parse the world differently. English, for instance, has the word pets, and French doesn't. In English, you cannot call a baby it, which does work in languages such as Estonian or Finnish or Hungarian, which lack a grammatical gender. One example of this arbitrariness is the red light. Right? The red light can mean all kinds of things, and they're all dependent on semiotic context. It can mean stop in a traffic light, as opposed to go when that light becomes green. But it can also mean go, as in Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer's nose. It can mean come in certain establishments in eponymously called red light districts. It can also mean go out in exit signs. Again, it's a convention, social and cultural, and so on. There's actually a story that during the Cultural Revolution in China in the 60s and 70s, Madame Mao disapproved of the fact that red lights meant stop, because red is, of course, the color of progress. Now, those ideas were never implemented because, well, you might imagine the issues with changing the meaning of traffic lights from one day to another, but you get the point. Second, language is differential. It's a system of differences. What makes each element of a language what it is, what gives it its identity, are the contrasts between it and other elements within the system of language. We don't know these elements positively, only negatively, in relation to something that's closely adjacent to it. For instance, when we talk about the 8:30 London Express, this train gets its identity from the fact that it's not the 9:30 London to Cambridge Express or the 8:45 Oxford local. What counts are not any of the physical features of a particular train either. The engine, the carriage, the exact route, the personnel, and so on, they may all vary. The times of departure and arrival can vary as well, right? The train may leave and arrive late. What gives this train its identity is its place in the system of trains. It is this train as opposed to the others. Saussure writes, a segment of language can never in the final analysis be based on anything except its non-coincidence with the rest. Differences, in other words, enable it to signify. If the sign is both arbitrary and differential, that is, if there is no such thing as a natural sign, if on one side of the border, as de Saussure puts it, we look at a cow and say ox, and if on the other side of the border we look at the same cow and we say buff, and if we then cross a considerable body of water and then look at a cow and say cow, well, it seems clear that the relationship between the thing and the sign just doesn't exist. A quick word on the nature of that structure of language. The Saussure's idea about langue is that it is synchronic or paradigmatic. What that means is langue is not something that unfolds in time, it is something that exists in a fixed moment. If you're thinking about language as a system, and if you want to map out that system, that variety of ways in which language organizes signs, you can't also think about it unfolding historically. You have to sort of stop time and look at it as a frozen system. And that's what structuralism does. Parole is, as they say, diachronic or syntagmatic. That is, it does operate in time. Right? We study language in time. Even looking at a poem or something is looking at parole. It's looking at language in use. And as such, it's something that exists in time. The beginning of the sentence happens at a different time than the ending. So the whole point of the hermeneutic circle is diachronic in that sense. But what the Saussure says is, if we want to extrapolate the underlying structure of language from that, we have to resort to a moment in time, to a synchronic view. Saussure literally says we ought to put both feet on the ground of language if we want to understand it as a system. Otherwise, it just becomes a convoluted mess. Only then can we start mapping out how it is that language is structuring things. So that's something that you might be able to say against some forms of structuralism, that they're very ahistorical. Now finally, what you see here is a graph by Claude Lévi-Strauss. He was an anthropologist in the 1960s. And here he's looking at the formation of the Oedipus myth. And he's assembled lots of versions of this myth, and he says, hey, if you look at all these various versions, you can see that certain things are basically happening and they fall into certain discrete categories. So when reading from left to right, row by row, the chart explains the story of Oedipus in chronological order. And from the top of each column to the bottom, from the first column to the last, the chart analyzes the story of Oedipus into the four most important relationships that Lévi-Strauss has found in it. So it's these kinds of elaborate structures that structuralism is typically interested in. When you look at this from the perspective of the digital humanities, it all looks pretty familiar. Many acts of distant reading are structuralist activities in the sense that we are precisely not interested in the particularity of one work, as the formalists or new critics were, but in sort of a virtual object that is the aggregate of all the instances that we have. Before we end, maybe it's good to spell out the difference between structuralism and the formalisms that we spoke of earlier. Roland Barthes, a spokesperson for structuralism here, he wrote that structural man takes the real, decomposes it, then recomposes it. And what he means by that is that the structuralist has as the goal something outside the object that they're looking at. They don't take one thing into account, but a bunch of variants or versions, a bunch of data, and ask what are the basic constituent units of all these items of data? What is the umbrella term? And then it starts observing that virtual object. Formalism had no interest in that. It only decomposes insofar as it breaks down the object into its respective functions, showing how they relate to each other, thinking about the way in which it's put together, but there's nothing outside of the object. In this week's classes, we will look at what happens to structuralism itself, because as the word post-structuralism already indicates, this is not the end of the story. And if you take this project of structuralism to its logical end, what you get is not actually a very stable form of structure, but something else entirely. We'll look at that in this week's class, so I look forward to seeing you then.